Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a breakdown of the image quality from the Zeiss Loxia 85mm F2.4 lens. This is a Sonnar optical design, and so we're going to see how it handles the various metrics that I've run it through. I've actually been shooting with the lens now for a fair while in a lot of different kinds of situations, so I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on what's happening underneath the hood with this lens. So let's jump in and let's take a look at some of the image quality results. Okay, let's start things off by comparing an uncorrected raw file. This is on a Sony A7R Mark III, so very high resolution. And so here we have got wide open f2.4 on the right, uncorrected. On the left, we have got the standard profile in Lightroom that's been applied. So what we can see is that there is definitely some vignette lifting across a fair portion of the frame. And it's not necessarily particularly heavy at any point, but definitely there's a lot of lifting that's taking place. As far as distortion goes, there's not a whole lot there to correct, and so I mean basically the profile is going to take care of vignette. So let's see how vignette naturally clears up. Here at f2.4, as we saw already, a fair bit of vignette. Moving on to f2.8, there's not a huge amount of difference. Remember, you're only going up a little over a third of a stop there. Now, if we move on to f4, we see a significant vignette lift. Now it's only in the extreme corners, and f5.6, you can see those extreme edges clear up. And then moving on to f8, we see nothing. And so by f5.6, vignette is completely eliminated, or at f4, it's only there in the extreme corners. So how about resolution? In the center of the frame, if we take a look at a pixel level, we see that there are fantastic amounts of resolution and contrast, even at f2.4. Center portion of the frame is going to look pretty fab out of this lens. Moving off to the edge of the frame, we see that the sharpness moves out really across the majority of the frame. Right off here into the corners, we've got contrast and resolution. What I do see is a little stronger performance on the left side versus the right side here at f2.4. Now, once again, going to f2.8 is only a partial stop, but it is enough to make a difference. We see an intensifying of contrast, probably just a little bit of chromatic aberration, longitudinal chromatic aberration clearing up that removes just the slightest bit of haze, and now our textures are just popping there. They look fantastic. Off on the side of the frame, on the left side, I don't see a huge difference between f2.8 and f2.4. It might be there, but it's very minor. However, it's pretty obvious that there is some improvement on the right side of the frame. And what we see here mostly is that increase in contrast, reduced chromatic aberration, that does give a little bit more pop to the textures. Now at f4, I mean, we already had pretty well perfect performance in the center of the frame, so the difference there is so minor as to probably not be detectable for field use. If we look off to the side of the frame, we see a couple of things. Obviously, you've got a more even illumination, so vignette is mostly cleared up. And now even on the weaker side here, we have got, you know, nice looking resolution right out to the edge. On the left side of the frame, resolution looks great, but again, it's mostly vignette lift here. I don't see a huge difference in the actual resolution. At f5.6, there is the slightest bit of increased resolution there on the left side of the frame. Looking at the center of the frame, of course, it was already perfect. It remains perfect. I don't know that you can see much of a difference there. Right side of the frame, we now have a really strong performance on the right side, and so this is a great landscape aperture here, f5.6. At f8, there is a slight bit more contrast and resolution on the edge of the frame. The center of the frame, I think, has peaked at this point. You're not going to get any better than what we've got there, but your kind of optimal landscape aperture, I would say, is here at f8. Now our test where we look for the longitudinal chromatic aberration and thus kind of our contrast, we can see that already at the center of the frame, wide open, there is very, very little chromatic aberration. I mean, there's next to no green or purple fringing, and as a byproduct of that, like the text just really, really pops. And you can easily see the texture on the page here. And so, I mean, that's just a beautiful contrast. This was actually really the shot that demonstrated to me how fantastic the contrast from the lens was. For one thing, I actually know the conditions here, and it was extraordinarily bright. You have a lot of textures here that catch a lot of light, and so I wanted to just kind of shoot a narrow depth of field shot here. But, you know, obviously there's great contrast on the subject. This is wide open f2.4. But all of these areas that could be prone towards chromatic aberration or could lose contrast, which is all of this stuff, which could easily become hazy, indistinct, have fringing on it, none of it's there. I mean, and stepping back again, you can see some of the foreground bokeh quality there, but this is mostly about that amazing, amazing contrast and holding it in really, really bright conditions, which is somewhat unusual with shooting a prime lens wide open in my experience. Here's another example to illustrate that same point. Late summer, early fall, I love these little purple flowers just visually, but I know from experience shooting them, particularly when you've got actual direct sunlight on here, chromatic aberration often just makes these things look terrible when you're taking photos of them. But the Loxia 85 has obviously handled this just fine. So chromatic aberrations and very bright lights are really well controlled. Now, something that I wouldn't consider as positive, that great contrast sometimes has an impact in my experience with lenses when it comes to the bokeh quality, because it can be hard to have great contrast on the subject and then to go really soft and lose all of that contrast in the out of focus area. So I would say in some situations, the bokeh quality is a little busier from the 85mm than from some of the other Loxia lenses. But in other situations, that amazing micro contrast really makes for special images. Look at this, all of the dark areas of the branch against a bright background. And you see the beautiful, beautiful three-dimensional rendering micro contrast that's there. I mean, that looks fantastic. And I can tell you that that would not be the case if it weren't for the amazing contrast of the lens. Also, if you look at all of the edges where a lot of times you might see smearing or haze there, they're just beautifully delineated, even with light coming right through these leaves. I really think that's a beautiful result. Here's a similar type setting, and of course this shows the bokeh in a much kinder light here, less hard edges. It actually looks quite beautiful. And once again, kind of our same point there. Look at the edges, which you would want that to really stand out with that three-dimensional cutout quality, and this does it. I mean, I don't know that I've seen much better than what's happening right there. Now, I've kind of hit the theme already of the micro contrast, but I do want to look at a similar type image here, which, I mean, look at that resolution. That's just fantastic. But what you can also see here is beautiful, beautiful color rendition. And it's a strength of the whole Loxia series, but I mean, I would say that the 85mm is, even amongst the Loxia series, is a standout to me. And I think the colors pop in part because there is so much contrast. Another illustration that just kind of shows off all of those things we've been talking about. Again, this is a scene that could be messed up by, you know, either losing contrast from the light coming against the frame, or you know, just because of chromatic aberrations. This lens does a great job, and look at those beautiful, beautiful colors. Now, moving indoors, let's take a look here. This is part of a video that I was shooting, and so anyway, I kind of turned the situation around and shot a still for a second. You can see that the color here and that contrast is just fantastic. Now, in this extremely difficult situation, glass with light coming through it, you can see a tiny bit of purple fringing on a few of those textures, but really this is quite well controlled for this circumstance. You can also see a little bit of green fringing there beyond, but these, you know, this is an extremely demanding situation, and that is very, very minimal. And you can see the micro contrast even in all of that the actual little water droplets that make up the steam coming off there. And just look at that color. I mean, it's just tons of pop to the image. Maybe the subject here would not enjoy the pose, but I wanted to show you how well the light is handled, a spotlight on the face. And obviously I've exposed for that, but nonetheless, this would be an easy area to be destroyed by chromatic aberrations or just an inability to handle those highlights, kind of the hotness of the light. Another shot here, and you can see just beautiful detail on the skin textures of the subject there. And this is just shot from the crowd, as you can see, and a really, really great result. Now this is the closest thing that I have to a real portrait, and I mostly just wanted to shoot through a lot of branches and leaves to see how it would handle the situation just out on a hike with my wife here. But this does work for our purposes in that you can see a really great handling of the actual skin tones here. And you can just see that it would work very well in a portrait setting, particularly if you value having great kind of contrast and textures rendered on your subject. Here in the hair, just lots of great detail that's there. Now, I've really been bragging this lens up. It does have a vulnerability, however. In this case, I actually positioned the sun in the frame in such a way, because I saw this happen just as I was passing through the scene, looking through the viewfinder. And so I knew that it could lose contrast. It could have some pretty heavy veiling under certain circumstances. And so this is with the lens at such a position as to where the sun is coming down kind of at an angle and hitting the actual front elements of the lens. And so you can definitely lose contrast. And then in this shot, I kind of made the most extreme example as I could. Now, again, there are applications for this kind of effect. It's artistic and somewhat non-destructive. However, note that in some situations, if you have the sun kind of in the perfect position, you will get a tremendous amount of veiling across the frame. Now, in a more direct situation, like if I'm allowing the sun to come through branches here, as I always try to do, because one thing, it shows off the sunburst really well. You can see that the lens actually does fantastic here. I mean, contrast has held up perfectly. Everything looks great, and that sunburst is just, it's gorgeous. I mean, it's great for this. You can see the very, clearly defined 10 aperture blades, but I don't find always that telephoto lenses do a great job with this, but I consider that to be fantastic. That's one of the best looking, medium telephoto sunburst effects that I've seen. Now, wrapping things up, we'll look at color again here for a few minutes. I mean, used as a landscape lens and stopped down a bit, I've shown you mostly, wide aperture, wide open kind of stuff. This lens makes a fantastic landscape lens because it has such beautiful color rendition, which you can see on display here. But look at the amount of micro contrast, for example, on the trunk and the bark textures here. I mean, it's just really amazing. And every one of these branches and leaves, it's just very, very clearly defined and detailed here. And it's just, it's the way that it handles the amount of contrast that is there is really, really impressive for these kinds of scenes. This kind of shot on a very kind of cold day, and so you can see the blue of the sky and of the water kind of reflecting that. But if you look here, the amount of contrast and detail throughout this scene, if you look at all of the grasses, the fine details that are rendered, and the amount of micro contrast on all of the colors, it really, really is impressive. It's kind of a corner-to-corner performance like that. And in many ways, this lens reminds me a lot of the Batis 135mm F2.8, kind of a similar amount of just really punchy images out of it. And so as you can see, this lens does have a lot of wide open pop, a lot of very strong micro contrast, beautiful, beautiful color rendition. The bokeh quality is good in some situations, but as sometimes happens with lenses that have a great amount of contrast, there are situations where the defocused area can have a little bit of hard lining or just be a little bit busier than what I might like. For the most part, however, in most situations, the bokeh quality is actually really nice from the lens, but I did note that in a couple of situations. What really stands out, however, is beautiful color rendition from the lens, and as I'll detail in the final episode, which will be coming to you shortly, I really think that the qualities of this lens translate particularly well into doing video with it. And in some ways, I like it better as a video lens than I do as a stills lens. And I'll detail that in my final review. But of course, if you'd like to see more images in the meantime, take a look in the description down below. I've got a linkage there to the image galleries that I've been contributing to during the course of this review. And there's also buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. You can also there become a patron, or you can follow me on social media, check out some of my work in the various social media sites that I share, my actual photography work. You can sign up for my newsletter. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.